Okay, for this pre-bronze, if you are ahead or you missed it, we're going to be talking about ions and their compounds. So ions are a new subject. So today, you should be able to describe the formation of ions from their parent atoms, to learn their names, to predict which ion a given element forms, and to describe how ions combine to form neutral compounds. So in general, what's an ion? You haven't heard that before. In a chemical reaction, atoms can form ions by gaining or losing electrons. Only electrons, never protons. Protons are always the same. Proton is your DNA. So metals tend to lose one or more electrons to form positive ions called cations. I like to think of these as happy cats. I'll draw you a cartoon when you get back to school. So magnesium, for example, has 12 electrons normally. And that's a neutral magnesium atom, and you have 12 protons always. But if I take away 2 electrons, then I have 10 electrons, my cloud is much smaller, and I've created a more stable ion. But that's called Mg2+. And then cations are generally named by using the name of the parent atom. That just means we call it magnesium. So the parent atom is magnesium, but Mg2+ is still a magnesium ion. Nonmetals, however, tend to gain electrons, so they take them. And this makes it a negative ion because you're adding a negative charge, and these are called anions, not anions. The way that you can remember this is it looks like the word onions, and onions make you cry, so it's anion. Here you have an example here. You have chlorine, which is neutral, and at neutral it has 17 electrons, but it has space for one more. So when you add the electron, it means that you're going to gain one for 18, and you've gained a negative charge. So it's more negative than it's positive, and we call it a chloride ion. Anions are named by using the root, so the first half of the element, and then the suffix IDE. So notice how we call this chlorine, but when it's an ion, we call it chloride. So, how do you find the charges on the periodic table? The ion that a particular atom will form can be predicted from the periodic table. So, for your metals in groups 1 and 2, your alkali and your alkaline earth, they form 1+ and 2+ ions respectively. It's the same as the number of valence electrons. So group 1 has 1 valence electron, group 2 has 2 valence electrons, so they lose 1 and 2 atoms. Elements in group 7, which is nonmetal, forms an anion with a 1- charge. Group 6, which is also a nonmetal, forms anions with 2- charges. So elements close to the sides of the periodic table, so 6 and 7 and 1 and 2, gain or lose electrons so that they have a full outer shell. So for 1 and 2, they get rid of electrons to have a full shell, and 6 and 7, they gain electrons to have a full shell. It's called the noble gas configuration. Remember that group 8 doesn't react ever because they have a full shell already. So I'm going to show you a diagram here. Make sure that you screenshot this video at this point so you can remember. So group 1 loses 1 electron, group 2 loses 2 electrons, group 3 loses 3 electrons, and then in 6 and 7, it's 8 minus the number of valence electrons. So what ions would be formed from the elements with the following atomic numbers? And what noble gas has the same number of electrons as these ions? So, I have 53, 38, 7, 55, 88, 9, 13. And I want you guys to pause and figure out what ions would be formed. So you find these elements, these atomic numbers, and figure out which ions they would form. So make sure you're pausing your video to do this. Alright, compounds that contain ions. Ions form to combine, and they create ionic compounds. The following are the properties of ionic compounds. That means you have a metal and a non-metal joined together. They have a high melting point, so it has to be really hot to melt them. They conduct electricity if they're melted. So like salt, melted salt will conduct electricity. And these are just diagrams here. So if you dissolve salt in water, then it can conduct electricity. Ionic compounds are electrically neutral, so you have picked an atom that has a positive ion and an atom that has a negative anion, so a cation and an anion. They join together, so overall everything is balanced. The charges on all the anions and cations are summing up to 0, so you'll have a -2 bond with a +2. Compounds that contain ions, so the formula is here. You write the cation element followed by the anion element. So if I have Mg, which is 2+, and Cl with a minus, I have 1 Mg and 2 Cls. So that means it'll be Mg there and then Cl2 as the whole thing. But the cation always comes first. So we give you the good news, the happy before the sad. So if we go through these, and if you're following along at home, make sure that you're pausing. So what compound would be formed from these? Na plus and Cl minus. This is a 1 plus and this is a 1 minus. So our compound is just NaCl. Same thing with Kf. Our compound would just be Kf because these balance out. Now Fe3 plus balances with P3 minus, so that would just be Fe and then P. But now here I have +1 and -2. So I need another positive charge on my Na. So my compound together would be Na2S. Then here it's the opposite, MgCl2. Here 2 plus on the Mg equals 2 minus on the O. So those would work as just MgO. Here you switch them, so that would be FeCl3. And then Na3P, so you just switch those numbers. Make sure that you are trying this last example on your own at home. And in the next module, you'll learn a method called the pop, lock, and drop it, or the crisscross, to write these charges. All right, now next question. What would be the symbol of an ion of the isotope nitrogen 15? So if this ion in general has the isotope of nitrogen 15, nitrogen normally has 7 electrons. So what would nitrogen 15 be like? So I want you to think on that brainstorm question, and your answer to that question will get you to be able to move on to the bronze level. But in summary, the things that you need to know. Cations are metals on the left side of the periodic table that have lost electrons. So they lose an electric charge and are too positive. And then anions, like onions that make you cry, are negative because they have gained an electron. And the whole reason that ions happen is so that you can have a noble gas configuration or a full outer shell, which is just equal to 8 electrons.